Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're setting aside some of the bigger picture stuff. We're really going to drill down into maybe the most fundamental domain, identification and authentication, IAA, right. If you handle sensitive government info, like FCI or CUI, well, this is your gatekeeper. It's all about knowing if the person touching your system is actually supposed to be there.
That's exactly right. The core mission here, kind of the fortune cookie summary, is super simple. Make sure people are who they claim to be. And that really happens in two stages. First, you've got identity validation, proving who you are before you even get credentials.
Okay, so prove it first.
Right. Then phase two is protecting those credentials, the digital keys, making sure they're safe with things like strong encryption, password complexity, maybe even hiding the characters as you type.
So the journey starts with making sure everyone is unique. We verify the person, give them a unique digital ID, basically. And then we demand some kind of complex protected input, username, password, maybe MFA, every single time they want in.
Exactly. And, as the organization gets bigger or the data gets more sensitive, the requirements ramp up, you absolutely have to enforce complexity rules. And eventually, multi-factor authentication becomes pretty much standard for almost all access, definitely for admin roles. It's not really optional anymore. It's just the cost of doing business in this space.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting at the beginning, like any good security plan, knowing exactly who and what is on your network. Practice 3.5.1. This is a big one, right? 5 points. Focusing on this core identification piece.
Yeah, the goal is total clarity. We need to identify every single system user, every automated process that's, acting for a user, and every device that accesses the system. And this one really leans heavily on having good documentation across the board and policies that are actually enforced.
Right. I think we sometimes forget how much compliance really rides on that documentation. So for an assessor looking at level 1, what are they checking? They're digging into Active Directory, making sure accounts are unique, verifying hostname conventions, stuff like that.
Yeah, basically checking the foundation. Are the lists clean? Do the names make sense to avoid duplicates? But then when you jump to level 2 assessment, it shifts. It's less about the paper and more about how the policy's applied. They'll actually talk to your account managers, ask about rules for reusing IDs. They'll test the processes to make sure there's no ambiguity. Think about it like, okay, say Susan worked here for 5 years, left for 6 months maybe, lost her shirt betting on meme stocks.
Happens to the best of us.
Right. And now she wants her old job back. If the system just flips her old ID, S. Smith, back on, well, now we've lost that clean connection. We can't easily link her current actions to the fact she just signed off on new training and policies today. That lack of clarity, that ambiguity, that's what 3.5.1 is designed to stop. The system has to know that the Susan logging in today is the same compliant Susan who just walked back in the door.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's not just about stopping bad guys from getting in. It's about keeping that audit record absolutely pristine. And what's interesting is doing this work, ensuring unique IDs and documenting it all, it actually helps with those lower level access controls too, doesn't it?
Exactly. It all stacks up. Your unique ID policies here directly strengthen your basic authorization controls everywhere else. And look, when you're building these policies, you really, really need to be looking at NIST Special Publication 800-3, Revision 3. That's the key document. It defines the different levels of digital identity assurance. It's basically the Bible for this whole IA domain.
Okay, speaking of things you need first, let's move to practice 3.5.2, another 5-point heavy hitter. Authentication as a prerequisite. So, you have to authenticate or verify the identity of every user, process, and device before you let them access anything.
Yeah, this one sounds pretty straightforward logically, right? But here's where it gets a bit sticky sometimes. Authenticating users. We mostly have that down. But the real challenge often lies in authenticating and verifying the devices. Organizations really need to think hard about the best way to do that.
Wait, hang on. Why is authenticating a device harder? Doesn't it just have an IP address or something?
Well, sometimes. But an IP address alone isn't always enough, you see. If we only rely on the IP, anyone spoofing that IP could potentially get in. We need something more concrete, tied to the physical device or its digital identity. Maybe that means issuing digital certificates to all your company devices. Or maybe using a network access control, an NAC solution that checks the device's health. Is it patched, configured correctly before it's allowed onto the sensitive network parts?
If you haven't figured out device authentication, that's a potentially huge gap.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that matters, especially if something goes wrong. You mentioned this is really key for looking back after an incident. Oh, absolutely. Authentication is your primary tool for figuring out what happened, peeling back the layers to see who did what, when they did it, and from where. This becomes super important when you're dealing with things like shared service accounts, where maybe one password is used, but you have to be able to trace its use back to the specific person who managed or used that credential last.
Gotcha.
Accountability.
That clarity is just invaluable. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something critical. Multi-factor authentication, MFA. Practice 3.5.3, levels 2 and 3.
Right. And this one, it's completely non-negotiable now, and it has real consequences if you don't do it. MFA must be used for local and network access for privileged accounts, so your admins. And it must be used for network access for non-privileged accounts, too. Basically, if you're connecting remotely to get to CUI, you need MFA. Full stop.
And the penalty for not having it is steep.
Yeah.
Right. I think the draft framework said something about losing 5 points straight away if it's missing where it's required.
Yeah.
That's a big hit.
It's huge. Assessors will check that MFA is required for all those privileged users, and they will talk to your sysadmins about exactly how they access admin accounts, whether they're in the office or logging in from home.
Okay, and here's a useful tip we found in the source material, something about combining checks. If you're going through an assessment, proving MFA can sometimes be done alongside proving system integrity.
Yes, exactly. That's a smart way to approach it. The MFA validation process often overlaps quite nicely with some system integrity controls. Like, you prove you're using MFA to log in, which confirms who you are. And at the same time, your SI controls should be ensuring that the network traffic during that login wasn't messed with, wasn't intercepted. So yeah, you can potentially knock out two objectives by looking carefully at how that authentication happens over the network.
Smart. Okay, let's look at practice 3.5.4 next. It's only 1 point, but sounds important. Employ replay resistant authentication.
Yeah, small but vital. The basic idea here is stopping someone from sniffing your login credentials off the network as you send them, and then just reusing them moments later to pretend to be you. It prevents those replay attacks.
Makes sense. So how do we check that we're resistant?
Well, two main things. First, you confirm that any old, weak protocols that allow replay attacks are explicitly banned and, shut down everywhere in your environment. Second, you verify that your current login methods use modern, secure protocols, think TLS or IPsec, and critically that your authentication mechanisms include something like a timestamp or a dynamic one-time token. This proves the login request is fresh and valid right now. If it looks old, the system should just reject it.
Okay, let's move into what feels like the theme of managing the whole ID lifecycle, starting with practice 3.5.5, level 2, prevent identifier reuse.
Right. So the organization has to define a period of time during which an old ID, like a username, cannot be reactivated or given to someone else. And then crucially, you have to enforce that rule. And here's maybe the thing people miss most often. This doesn't just apply to user accounts. It also applies to devices. Think network printers, specific application service accounts, things like that.
Wait, really? ID reuse for a printer? Why does that matter so much?
Because every device, especially one that logs onto the network, has some kind of identifier, right? And that ties its activity into your audit logs. So imagine you swap out an old printer and you immediately reuse its ID, say part 001, on a brand new printer that maybe isn't fully hardened yet. Now your logs become confusing. Is this log entry from the old, possibly vulnerable printer you just took offline, or the new one? You need that clear separation for the audit trail.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And the tip here is just to disable IDs in Active Directory instead of deleting them. That helps prevent accidentally creating a duplicate later, which ties back to 3.5.1, ensuring uniqueness.
Exactly right. It all connects. Next up is 3.5.6. Disable identifiers after inactivity. Pretty straightforward. You define how long an account can be inactive, say 60 days, 90 days, whatever your policy is. And then the system has to automatically disable that identifier once it hits that threshold. Assessors will check this. They'll run reports, look at last login dates for user accounts, and they'll also make sure you're monitoring non-OS accounts too, things like web apps, network gear for inactivity, and disabling them as well.
And a quick mention for 3.5.9 about temporary passwords. If the system gives out a temporary password, it must force the user to change it to a permanent one immediately upon first login, like that reset on first use setting.
Yeah, that's absolutely critical. Using static, known passwords for initial setup that just linger. That's a massive security hole, especially if old employees or installers might know those defaults. It's a simple fix, but it closes a really big potential door for attackers.
Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty of modern password protection. Practice 3.5.7 is password complexity. We need minimum complexity rules, rules about changing characters, and importantly, we need to enforce them. usually through something like a group policy object, a GPO.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is how the thinking has evolved a bit. For ages, complexity meant forcing symbols, numbers, uppercase, lowercase. But now a lot of the modern guidance actually favors length and maybe randomness more. Think long passphrases instead of super complex, hard to remember passwords that people just end up writing down anyway.
Ah, the classic security versus usability battle.
It really is. But the key for assessment is that whatever your defined policy is, it has to be enforced, technically. The challenge, and where assessors often find issues, is with devices that aren't part of your main domain, maybe. Routers, intrusion detection systems, things that might not get those GPO settings. You've got to show you have manual processes or other checks in place to make sure those passwords meet the complexity rules, too.
Okay, let's connect that to 3.5.8, prohibit password reuse. We have to specify how many passwords the system remembers, right? So you can't just cycle between two passwords. The guidance suggests maybe a minimum of the last 5.
Yeah, something like that. The exact number should be defined in your policy, but the point is to stop people from just toggling between, password 123 and password 124 every time they're forced to change it. It forces actual variation, which is key.
And then the really heavy lifting for protection. 3.5.7, cryptographically protected passwords. Passwords have to be protected when they're stored and when they're flying across the network.
Right. And this is where we need to be really careful about the terminology and the tech. When passwords are stored, just encrypting them isn't really good enough anymore because encryption can be reversed if you have the key. What's required now are one-way cryptographic hashes using strong algorithms like bcrypt or Argon2. The idea is if someone steals your password database, they can't just decrypt the passwords. They have to try and crack each hash individually, which is computationally very expensive and slow.
Okay, so strong hashes for stored passwords. What about when they're in transit, moving across the network?
That's generally simpler, thankfully. It's mostly about ensuring all connections, especially to network resources or cloud services, are using encryption like SSL/TLS. We just need to confirm passwords aren't being sent in the clear, meaning, readable text across the network. And maybe the simplest helpful tick here isn't technical at all. It's telling people about having a clean desk. Don't write passwords down. All the fancy hashing in the world doesn't help if the password's on a sticky note on the monitor.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay.
Okay, finally, practice 3.5.11, the last one in this domain. Obscure feedback, making sure the authentication info is hidden, the stars or dots when you type it in.
Yeah, this is basically to stop shoulder surfing, right? Someone looking over your shoulder as you type your password. Assessors will test this. They'll try logging into workstations, secure websites, mobile apps, just to make sure the characters are hidden, maybe only flash briefly, if at all. But here's a really common trap, a hair-on-fire moment for assessors, that reveal password option. The little eyeball icon you see everywhere now.
Oh yeah, the eyeball.
That thing. It often completely undermines this control. Organizations must use GPOs or specific application settings to disable that reveal feature, at least within the CUI environment. You have to ensure the obscured feedback actually stays obscured.
Wow. Okay. That was an incredibly thorough deep dive into identification and authentication. It really does cover the whole life cycle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It forces organizations to think about managing users, yes, but also processes and devices right from the moment an ID is first created all the way until it's eventually disabled or retired.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway, the thing you really need to remember, is the absolute need for alignment. Whatever your organization says it's doing in its policies and procedures, whether that's MFA rules, password complexity, how you handle ID reuse, that must be exactly what an assessor finds when they actually look at the systems and verify things. IA demands that documentation and reality match up perfectly.
So given that, and thinking about that NIST Special Publication 863 Revision 3, it seems like it underpins almost everything we just talked about.
Yeah.
3.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.7, 0.8. It keeps coming up. Here's a final thought for you, the listener. Instead of maybe getting overwhelmed by all 11 IEA practices right now, what if you started by really mastering just that one document, NIST 863? If you truly understand those core principles of digital identity proofing, assurance levels, and the technical controls it outlines, maybe that gives you the foundational knowledge to make navigating the entire IEA domain and that checklist feel a whole lot less daunting. Something to think about.